Good afternoon. I want to call this hearing of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee to order, and be called for votes at 4:30. So in order to make sure we can get plenty on the record in the way of questions, the ranking member and I have agreed to dispense with opening statements, and we would ask each of the witnesses to submit theirs for the record, and we will go straight to questions after I introduce our distinguished panelists. We have with us today the Honorable Robert Scherer, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategic Capabilities, U.S. Department of Defense, Dr. Arthur Hopkins, Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Weapon Defense Programs, U.S. Department of Defense, Vice Admiral Terry Benedict, Director of Strat Systems Programs, U.S. Navy, and Major General Garrett Harensack, Assistant Chief of Staff for Strategic Deterrence and Nuclear Integration, U.S. Air Force. And with that, this is for being here. I really appreciate the time and energy it takes to prepare for these hearings, and it matters a lot. We appreciate you making the time for us. And I'll recognize myself for the first round of questions. Let's see here. Yeah. In the opening statement I submitted for the record, I mentioned a message to the force from then Secretary Defense Hagel, which is in your binder. It's dated November of last year, and without objection, I'd like to enter that into the record. Hearing none, so ordered. The letter is a remarkable statement of defense priorities, and it makes clear that the nuclear deterrence is the nation's #1 priority defense mission. We've seen this priority reflected in statements from many senior DoD officials, and I believe we've started to see that priority reflected in budget requests. We've also seen in Secretary Carter's policy documents, including his guidance for employment of the force and readiness availability priorities. Mr. Scherer, from a policy perspective, tell us why nuclear deterrence is the nation's, quote, highest priority defense mission, close quote, as Secretary Hagel stated in his letter to the force.
Certainly, Chairman, be happy to.
Turn your microphone on.
It's on.
And then pull it up close.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Simply put, nuclear forces are critical to ensuring that we and our allies can effectively address threats, especially from nuclear states. That is the key focus. We believe that nuclear forces deter attack on the United States and our allies, and nuclear weapons are also critical to ensuring that adversaries don't think they can escalate out of a crisis if conventional forces aren't useful for them. So it is imperative that we maintain the nuclear forces, that we maintain the deterrence, that these forces are credible, effective, reliable, and can be used and multiple options across a range of activities should this so happen. We still believe that the use of nuclear weapons is unlikely, but we are not willing to take the chance that it couldn't happen because of the catastrophic consequences should it.
Okay. Dr. Hopkins, please take a minute to explain what the Department sees as the key investment priorities for the nuclear deterrence mission in FY16 and beyond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As noted in our fair amount of consistency there, the Department's priorities are for the sustainment and modernization of the complete triad of the full force. And that starts with the submarine force, the refurbishment, or rather the life extension program for the Trident II missile, and the bombers, the long-range strike bomber, as well as the cruise missile, long-range standoff missile. Along with that, we also are partnered with the Department of Energy. It's very important that our programs be synchronized so that the delivery systems and the weapons arrive at the same time.
Okay. And this will be for Admiral Benedict and General Harensack. In February, Admiral Haney told this committee that DoD spends less than 3% of its budget on nuclear forces, and that during the peak years of modernization, only 5 to 6% of defense spending will go toward nuclear forces. To both of you, how should we be looking at this question of, quote, affordability of nuclear modernization given the priority DoD assigns to the nuclear deterrence mission?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. Sir, I would submit that there's while the percentage of the defense budget is, as you stated, 3 to 6%, I think that leadership should be expecting from the United States Navy and the United States Air Force options to ensure that that money is effectively spent. And to that, the United States Navy and the United States Air Force has been working the topic of commonality to ensure that whatever resources we are provided, that those are utilized as efficiently as possible. I would submit that as a response, sir.
Mr. Chairman, to add to that, as the United States Air Force modernizes and recapitalizes its two legs of the triad, every time we begin a process of looking at what to do, affordability is always the key aspect of what we're doing. And to that end, we believe that we can have an affordable triad as long as we can been doing the past few years with the United States Navy, and then leveraging the great innovation of our industry partners to make sure that we can have a safe, secure, and effective stockpile.
Great. And let's stay with you, General. Why does the United States need the long-range standoff weapon, the follow-on to the current air-launched cruise missile?
Well, thank you for that question. The outcome is the air-launched cruise missile. It was a 1982 weapon with a 10-year service life, and it is a key aspect of our nuclear deterrent. It is a main priority focus of STRATCOM, and it gives us a unique capability to give the government and the President of the United States a wide range of options across the entire spectrum of conflict. A cruise is a standoff weapon, and much like every other aspect of human conflict, the nuclear deterrent option also needs a standoff and a direct attack. And what that allows us to do is across the entire spectrum, across any possible scenario out there, to give options. How it may decide to use those options, but it gives options where we could respond to a wide range of threats. Specifically, the outcome is, as I already said, it's a 10-year lifespan, and it's going. So we're absolutely committed as the United States Air Force to providing an affordable long-range strike option, which allows us to have wide-ranging capabilities across the entire spectrum of conflict. And certainly in the closed session, we could talk about the very specific classified reasons why we'll need that capability in A2AD environment.
Okay. And why do we need a nuclear-armed cruise missile if we have a penetrating bomber and the B-61 nuclear gravity bomb?
Well, sir, simply because we need standoff and we need direct in this particular mission set as the air-delivered portion of the triad. It creates opportunities for us. It vastly complicates a potential enemy's defenses. And most importantly, as I said, it gives options that we would perhaps someday, if we don't pursue this. This is a capability, as I said, ever since human conflict, we've had direct attack and we've had standoff. And in this particular mission set is no different than any other mission set. We need that capability for our airmen that are going to be given a very difficult task in a number of highly important scenarios. We believe it's a capability, and so does Admiral Haney and STRATCOM, and that we absolutely must fill.
Dr. Hopkins, would the Nuclear Weapons Council agree with that assessment, and Mr. Schur, would OSD policy agree with it?
Mr. Chairman, the Nuclear Weapons Council would agree with that.
Absolutely, and the only thing I would add on top of the excellent answer from my Air Force colleague is that we should not be in a position where the only option that we give the President to use the air leg of the triad is putting a piloted airplane over enemy airspace to drop a gravity bomb.
Okay. With that, I will yield to my friend and colleague from Tennessee, the ranking member, for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your holding this hearing, and I look forward to the classified session to follow. In the meantime, let me return to base really on the 2016 budget and the adequacy thereof, or not, for our nuclear forces. So isn't the first and most important point is we need at least the President's budget request. Nothing less will suffice.
Sir, if I can answer, agreed, absolutely. I'd say that's the case for the overall defense budget. We have been very clear that we need the president's budget request. We think it solves and fixes some of the problems that were created with sequestration that we are still trying to get out of. The nuclear enterprise is no different from any of those, and especially because this budget reflects changes and increases to the nuclear enterprise budget that we put in as a result of the study. Nuclear enterprise review, it is even more critical to make sure that we have the president's budget request for the sustainability of the current force and the modernization of the future force that we are committed to doing. Sequestration would be a disaster for the Defense Department, the strategy, but also especially the nuclear enterprise.
Well, let me editorialize for a moment. The good news is it looks as if we'll avoid the disaster you're describing and we'll come in with a number slightly above the president's request. The bad news is we're pretending that OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations, will pay for that, which is off budget, which is like borrowed money, which is like a Band-Aid. So we really haven't fixed sequestration if we're not really paying for our nuclear forces, but pretending we're going to pay for our nuclear forces. So that, I'm afraid, is the situation that we're in, but I don't want to get any of the witnesses in trouble by agreeing or disagreeing with me on that. But let me note, I thought Dr. Hopkins' testimony was particularly well summarized, going through a number of the weapons programs and what our process of modernization involves. But on page 7 of Dr. Hopkins' testimony, there are sentences that I think should be highlighted for the purposes of this hearing. This one should be noted for the record. Quote, "The Nuclear Enterprise Review highlighted evidence of systemic problems in the strategic deterrent forces that threaten the future safety, security, and effectiveness of our nuclear forces." Wow. That's a heavy-duty sentence, and everybody who is aware of our nuclear enterprise should take that to heart. Another sentence we need to focus on is this. The fact that the Nuclear Deterrent Enterprise Review Group, chaired by Deputy Secretary of Defense Work, be focusing attention and resources at all levels of the DoD on this essential mission. So the NER noted huge problems. The NDERG's going to fix them, hopefully with the full cooperation of the subcommittee and of Congress. But nothing is more important, as our Navy friends are always excellent in money. They usually lead with the importance of the nuclear enterprise here. I don't want to go over too much dirty laundry, but there have been a sad litany of failures and problems in recent years, and we would hope that with this budget request going forward, we will fix these problems. Again, my purpose isn't to get any of the witnesses in trouble here, but I think we should have a heightened level of responsibility, because past witnesses may have mouthed the words, but somehow safe, secure, and reliable was not necessarily the result. If, in fact, there was only one wrench for 3 missile fields in the planes, and apparently that wrench had to be FedExed from spot to spot. You know, that's just probably one of the more visible examples of failure of the system, but there have been others. Do any of the witnesses have recommendations for this subcommittee as to what we should focus on other than giving you enough money for your work?
I will just take the opportunity to perhaps get myself in trouble, but nonetheless, I think the money for the work, we appreciate the subcommittee and the full committee's support of the Defense Department's and the President's budget request. And in fact, to put a finer point on the OCO discussion that you had, this plan, being able to plan, to be able to put in a systematic plan to years is critical for us. Stability and clarity and transparency of budget figures is important for us to be able to deal with not just this year, but future years. So we would ask, and I know we are working to try to get to a situation where we are not reliant on OCO to cover the funding gaps.
Dr. Hopkins?
In addition to the resources, both in fiscal 18 and over the sustained period, I think that you asked about what this subcommittee could do, your attention and your concern for the Get Well plan and the aftermath of the nuclear enterprise reviews is very helpful. As you know, the Deputy Secretary is chairing this Nuclear Deterrent Enterprise Review Group, which is a sustained attention to the problem. And as far as assistance, I think the attention from this group and the concern expressed by this group is helpful.
Do you need any more help than that, or would Congress just be getting in the way?
Not that I can think of.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no more questions at this time.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, now recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Mr. Scher, the Congressional Budget Office has estimated the cost of maintaining nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles to be $348 billion over the next decade, or about $35 billion per year, including inflation. Do you agree with this figure?
I don't have the exact figure for 10 years. We do extensive planning for the 5-year plan, but the 3%, about 3% of the budget is what we see for this over this fiscal year. And then I think we get up to right around 3%, maybe a little bit more. The peak is at FY20 in the plan. But so I would have to take a look at the specific numbers to make sure that they track with ours. But we are reliable. We have looked at in depth the 5-year development plan versus the 10-year.
And Mr. Scher, what action is the United States taking as a result of Russia's violation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty?
The first action that we're taking is working and trying to convince the Russians to come back into compliance with the INF Treaty. As you know, we have reported that the Russians have violated the INF. We hope that we can show and demonstrate to them that there was a reason that why their predecessor government, the Soviet Union, went into this treaty in the first place, that it was in their safety, it was in their security, and benefited their security to do so. Simultaneously with trying to convince them of that, we are looking at what actions we can take to ensure that any violation of the INF Treaty does not provide significant military to the Russians. And as people have testified previously to this subcommittee and elsewhere, we look at that in sort of 3 categories of military activities. One is active defense, what we can do to defend places in Europe, locations that are that the INF treaty violating missile could reach. Another one is taking a look at how we could go about and actually attack that missile where it is in Russia. And then subsequently, a third part is looking at understanding that it is not simply attacking that capability, but that we can look at what things we can hold at risk within Russia itself. We are still looking at all of those possibilities, narrowing down what we think would be the most effective, and working very closely with our allies to determine how to best deter this aggression from Russia, deter and bring Russia back in.
With respect to your efforts to convince or persuade the Russians to get back into compliance, has this administration been successful with respect to any of the breaches by Russia of the INF Treaty?
Well, the one breach that we have reported to you, we have not been successful at getting them to understand that that is something that's not in their interest to do, we believe. We will continue to work with them while looking at the military options, but our patience is not limitless on this.
At what point in time does the United States start taking more aggressive action concerning the Russian government's failure to comply with their treaty obligations?
We are still, from an interagency perspective, working to figure out the exact timelines, especially in consultation with our allies. I will note that we've had increasingly detailed discussions with our allies about Russia overall, and this weighs into when we could make the decision. But we do want to see if there is a chance that they could realize that they are better off by coming back into compliance.
Same question with respect to NATO. Is NATO doing anything to try to force Russia to comply with its INF treaty obligations?
So we are working as part of the NATO alliance very carefully, both on the conventional side, as well as meeting as part of the NPG, the Nuclear Planning Group, looking at what NATO should be doing in response to the Russian violation of the INF Treaty, but also to look at this as a whole and understand that this is part of a broader aggressive posture from Russia. And I can go into more details, if you'd like, about the ins and outs of that in a closed session.
Thank you. And to all of our witnesses, please describe the impacts of the Nuclear Enterprise Review on the nation's nuclear forces and the men and women that serve in them. And you can go in whatever order you prefer.
So I'll just say from a policy perspective, we look at the nuclear enterprise reviews, both the internal one and the external one, as critical looks at the enterprise and giving us key understanding of what some of the problem areas certainly were, the need for broader accountability and attention to the nuclear enterprise throughout the department, and ensuring that it is supported throughout the department and that it is integrated into all of the ways we look at forces and operations in the department. And we are a part of that accountability mechanism. We have clear roles along with other people and other institutions represented here, and we welcomed the opportunity to really look at the results of that review and implement fixes that will fix this now and into the future.
Dr. Hopkins?
The nuclear enterprise reviews identified some issues, some long-standing issues that have been in the nuclear enterprise for a while, and the fixes aren't going to be easy. They're not going to be inexpensive. But the good thing that's happened is the department has stepped up to this. The department is putting alone in starting the fixes and adding more money over the future years program. I think perhaps one of the best things that's come of it has been a recognition of what a fine force we have out there in general, and a recognition that the professionalism of the nuclear force is paramount. Second good thing that's happened is that we mentioned the NDERG, the Nuclear Deterrent Enterprise Review Group, chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Defense. The highest levels of the Pentagon are engaged on this, and it's not. This isn't for one-time fixes. The Pentagon has established an enduring, persistent self-examination process using the Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Office to track every single recommendation made by the enterprise reviews and make sure we get at the root causes.
Thank you. Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Question for you, Mr. Chairman. When will the classified session take place?
Immediately after we conclude with this.
Then I'll keep just to one question. And that has to do with the question that was raised earlier about the 10-year time horizon, the cost associated with it. Dr. Hopkins, apparently you have a 25-year time horizon that you have been working on. Have you an associated cost with that?
Thank you for the question, sir. I do not have an associated cost with it. We, of course, will have cost estimates based on previous experience with the development of programs from earlier years, but we don't have a cost estimate with that.
Do you have associated estimated costs?
I believe we do.
And they are?
I don't have that number.
When can you get that number for us?
I'll take it for the record and get back to you.
Tomorrow?
Certainly.
Tomorrow?
Sure.
Thank you. My office number is?
Thank the gentleman. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Kaufman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Major General Hornkak, could you describe to me the need for the next generation man bomber as part of the triad?
Yes, sir. We believe that the essence of the United States Air Force is the ability to hold at risk any target in the world in a matter of hours or most days. And this ability allows no sanction for defense. The ability to penetrate enemy air defenses and prosecute the target is fundamental to what the United States Air Force does. And our ability to do that is in long-range strike aviation, specifically bombers, is not going to be possible with our legacy systems, the youngest of which is about 25 years old. Most of the All of our B-52s are 1961, 1960 models. These are old aircraft. The B-1s are also age. In fact, as our chief has said many times, our entire bomber fleet and any state in the union could qualify for antique license plates. The ability that we must have. And the reason I ask, and it's certainly a classified situation, we could give you, again, a lot of very compelling data as to the need to a long-range strike. But I like to tell people it's because no one ever wants to walk into the Oval Office and say, Mr. President or Madam President, I'm so very sorry, but we cannot neutralize that threat to America. And we need the long-range strike bomber, so no one ever has to do that.
But given all the advances, you talked about the cruise missile, that's been around for a long time, all the advances in guidance system, precision guided munitions that can be armed with nuclear weapons. Why is it, I mean, obviously we understand the air component part of the triad, but why is that necessary? Why can't unmanned capability replace manned capability in terms of that delivery system?
Well, I'm not saying it's sometime in the future that cannot. What we have to deal with is the capabilities we currently have, right, and what we foresee to be that capabilities in the future. We believe from the nuclear aspect, it's important to the triad. But I think it's important to realize that should the great day come when nuclear weapons disappear from the world, and if that happened tomorrow, we'd still need to build a long-range strike bomber because we must have a capability, again, to range with long-range, persistent, high-volume capability to destroy targets and allow no sanctuary anywhere to go. So that is currently best accomplished with a cranium in the cockpit. There may come a time where that's not required, but certainly it's required in the near and midterm future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Scher, some of us have been very concerned about the announcement of the framework points with Iran. Concerns that we have are that essentially it appears that these are going to replace the long-standing UN Iran to dismantle their uranium enrichment and plutonium production capabilities, and that's going to be replaced with a framework that in our minds literally, notwithstanding the claims that it would lengthen the breakout period, but that in the ultimate sense this would allow a zone of time, a buffer, as it were, to develop some of their ancillary research and other things that gives them an even more sure opportunity to ultimately become a nuclear-armed nation. Henry Kissinger and George Shultz opined that, quote, this deal will reinforce, not resolve, the world's challenges in that region. And we ameliorate some of our concerns. The administration has put forth this ostensible idea that they will now make sure that our Middle East allies are under our nuclear umbrella. And some of us are concerned that that creates a whole host of new strategic questions and risks. And I would like to essentially just is, in my judgment, a very, very dangerous deal, work that they would literally to try to quell our concerns by putting some of our Middle Eastern allies under our nuclear umbrella. Is that true from your point of view? And does that, you think, enhance the national security perspective of the United States?
I certainly, Congressman, have seen reports where individuals have opined, but not from the administration, about a nuclear assurance and guarantees for Middle East colleagues and allies and friends. So
you know nothing, that there's no consideration on the part of the administration to do that.
I think there's consideration about a range of things. I will tell you that the people who are involved with leased affairs, I certainly can get an answer from them as to where we are now. But my understanding is that we are continuing to look at ways that we can reassure our friends in the Gulf. But I have not seen where administration officials have spoken about nuclear guarantees as part of that. I can't say that no one is, but I have not seen that, and my understanding is that we are focused on the friends and allies that we have had in the past in terms of working closely with them, interoperability, foreign military sales, and especially missile defense cooperation in the Gulf Cooperation Council individual nations.
Well, I would just suggest that putting Iran on a surer footing, a surer track to become a nuclear-armed nation does not encourage our allies in the region. And terrified is probably a good word here. It seems the administration has chosen to punt here and rather than deal with the real issue, and they only make the equation more complicated down the road. And whatever the dangers are in preventing Iran from gaining a nuclear weapons capability, and there certainly are risks and dangers and costs to do that, they will pale in comparison to dealing with them once they have a nuclear weapons capability. And with that, General Harensack, I'll move on to you, sir. Regarding our aging nuclear infrastructure, I was hoping you could tell us what the analysis of alternative is for the follow-on to the Minuteman III regarding the cost of, as opposed to simply refurbishing in the life of the current Minuteman III. In other words, juxtapose that as from acquiring a new missile system or refurbishing the old one. We also, we have an aging fleet of B-52s. I'd love to hear your story about that. I know it's a very compelling one. How old is the B-52? How old will it be when we plan to retire it? And do you have any specific insight into it?
Oh, well, sir, thank you for the opportunity to talk about the GBSD. We believe that the best way to maintain the foundational aspect of the ICBMs that are what we believe to be foundational to our triad and nuclear deterrent is the Minuteman III is a 1970 weapon, as you know. We're doing the great airmen out there are doing a fantastic job of sustaining this missile as a weapon system with silos that are sometimes even older than the missiles themselves, and it is an amazing engineering challenge to keep that system up and functioning as well as it did. And certainly the nuclear reviews that we talked about a little bit have mentioned some of the things specifically focused on ICBMs that we need to reevaluate and work in a systemic and productive manner, and we're certainly doing that.
Gentleman's time's expired, and Chair's now going to recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Ashford, for 5 minutes.
If this has been asked, I apologize, I was a bit late, but the Global Strike Force at Offutt, the Functional Component Command, could you just, and if you've already talked about that, but could you just, if you have, I'm sorry to ask it again, but could you talk about that, the Offutt Air Force Base Joint Command, Functional Command Facility, just about its future and how you see it evolving? And I could ask, General, if you'd talk about that, or.
Well, sir,
and if that question's too obtuse, I apologize.
not really.
Well, the Joint Functional Command component at Offutt, and how do you see that evolving into the future, and whether it has the capability or the resources moving forward?
Unfortunately, sir, I'll have to get back to you for the record on that.
I don't have anything else.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When NATO published its Deterrence and Defense Posture Review, DPR, in 2012, NATO explicitly saw Russia as a cooperative partner for peace in Europe and the wider world. That was in 2012. That was after the invasion of Georgia, the current occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Since 2012, Russia has illegally annexed Crimea. They've destabilized broader eastern Ukraine. Certainly their actions and, of course, I guess their language towards other European nations has been hostile. And so we've got these challenges with Russia. Mr. Scheer, you sit on the U.S. representative to the high-level group within NATO, which does NATO's nuclear planning. Is NATO going to revisit the basic assumption of the DDP that Russia is a partner?
Congressman, I can't speak to where the alliance is coming down on the political issues. What I can speak to broadly in this forum, and will be happy to do in more detail in the classified session, is note that we on the HLG, the high-level group, as support to the nuclear planning group, the ministers sit in that forum, are taking a look at the capabilities that exist in Europe amongst all countries and determining how we can best ensure that the alliance remains safe and secure and that deterrence is maintained, and if deterrence fails, how we as an alliance can protect our interests and protect ourselves against any adversary that exists.
I understand that the alliance has 20 nations, and of course they all have various interests, and it's sometimes hard to come to a specific resolution on these important matters. But Russia is calling NATO a threat. Are we indicating to NATO that maybe we ought to consider Russia a threat?
We are certainly working with NATO. As you well know, as you said, it takes a while for 28 nations to consensus on things, but I have no doubt and can assure you that NATO is looking at the actions of Russia and looking to see and understand that these are actions that are assertive and aggressive towards friends and partners in the region, and that we need to start taking a look at both the actions and the capabilities of the Russian Federation.
The DDPR called for NATO-Russia cooperation on missile defense. NATO-Russia cooperation on missile defense. Is it your recommendation that we should rewrite the DDPR?
Certainly, we are no longer looking at any cooperation in missile defense with Russia at this point. In fact, NATO has specifically said that we will not have any interactions with Russia, given the actions that they have taken. In fact, the Wales Conference looks very clearly and makes clear statements about Russia's recent actions over the course of the past year.
So should we rewrite the DDPR then?
That is for my colleagues at the State Department to determine with ministers at that level, but certainly I can assure you that we are looking at actions that understand that the situation has changed since the writing of the DDPR.
Can you give us in this session any conversations that NATO has had regarding Russia's violation of the INF Treaty?
I would prefer to session, sir.
Okay. Admiral Benedict, question for you. When we think about our space communications architecture for nuclear deterrence, we use AEHF satellites. There's some talk about using some of that capacity for tactical purposes as well as strategic purposes. Is there a concern there that we might be cannibalizing some of our capacity for tactical?
Sir, thank you for the question. There's an actual ongoing review of what we call NC3 from an end-to-end perspective right now, led at the OSD level. That information has not yet been reported out, but I am confident that that action that you referred to is part of that review, and I respectfully request that we wait till that.
Do you know when that review would be complete?
Sometime this summer, sir. I don't have the exact date, but I can get back to you.
Okay, and I would love to have a copy of that if possible.
Understood.
Okay, and I'll yield back. I'm out of time.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lambert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Benedict, what is the minimum number of Ohio-class replacement submarines that are required to fulfill STRATCOM's requirements for sea-based deterrence? And I know we've talked about this before, but I think it's important to go on record about this.
Yes, sir. That would be the number in the program of record, which is 12, with 16 tubes per submarine, sir.
And what happens if you have less than 12?
Sir, if we have less than 12, then we have done the analysis and provided that to STRATCOM. We will not be able to meet the STRATCOM requirement of numbers at sea ready for in alert and mod alert status, as well as numbers at sea to support the STRATCOM requirement for a certain number of hours to have certain numbers at sea.
So if you have X number in the fleet. Some are always going to be at a base somewhere for being resupplied. Some will be training.
In maintenance, yes, sir.
And only a subset of that number will be available at any given time.
Yes, sir. Based on the analysis, 12 gives us confidence from a statistical standpoint that we will always have 10 ready for C, which is the number necessary.
Excellent.
For
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Scher, President Obama's nuclear employment guidance rejects the notion of quote-unquote de-alerting U.S. nuclear forces, though continuing to examine options to reduce the role of launch under attack. Please explain why the President chose to reject de-alerting U.S. ICBM forces.
I think the President, the way that we looked at this was that it did not make any great sense to de-alert forces, that we thought that all the forces that were there needed to be ready and effective and able to prosecute the mission at any point in time. And that was the determination made, that was valuable for presenting multiple options for the President and for safety, security, and assurity of the nuclear enterprise.
Okay, thank you. And following up on that, General Herensack, some critics have said that our ICBMs are under hair trigger alert. Is that an accurate categorization?
It's an absolutely not accurate, and it's an emotional aspect that people attach to this that is not fundamentally factual to what goes on in our ICBM launch control facilities. So absolutely not, sir. They're not under hair trigger alert. They are the very responsive, the most responsive aspect of our nuclear triad, but that characterization is inaccurate and unfair.
And thank you for clarifying, and there are many safeguards and checks and balances that are put into place, right?
There's a holistic system of safeguards put into place, absolutely, sir.
Thank you. And I've been to F.E. Warren and seen the underground command center, and I've seen how this has tremendous amounts of fail-safe provisions, and it's a great thing that's been done in setting up the system in an appropriate way. But nevertheless, the Nuclear Enterprise Review in 2014 identified a whole bunch of corrective actions, that the Air Force should carry out to fix leadership, morale, culture, and other problems. And some of those were in the ICBM force, being taken to improve the ICBM force.
A large slate of actions, sir, have been under place, and they started during our force improvement plan, which actually we started prior to the external review reports and the internal review reports and the STRATCOM report that the NRRs are all referencing now, and the tracking. A number of issues from personnel management to sustainment issues to the ability of us to ensure that the morale and career progression of our missileers is enhanced, has allowed a lot of positive improvements that have already been seen and continue to be seen in our ICBM force.
And one specific action, and I too, like the ranking member, was distressed when I heard about the wrench that had to be shared among several locations. Is there any situation like that today that you're aware of?
No, sir.
And was that an accurate report at the time?
It is actually there's like everything else. There's a little bit more to the story. That particular wrench was only used about 5 times in 8 years, and so somebody believing that they were actually doing something good decided, why don't we FedEx them? It would save a certain amount of money. In retrospect, that was a bad decision, but it was a decision based on the best of intentions.
All right, thank you, gentlemen, all for your service.
For votes right now, but we got a little time. Dr. Hopkins, your boss, Undersecretary Kendall, is the chairman of the Nuclear Weapons Council, and you are the executive director. Very briefly, do you think the council would benefit from having new members like, for example, the director of CAPE and its equivalent from NNSA, or the DoD comptroller and his equivalent from NNSA? Why or why not?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that question. As you know, Mr. Kendall chairs the Nuclear Weapons Council, and the other 4 members are the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Head of Strategic Command, the Undersecretary for Policy, and STRATCOM. And as the Nuclear Weapons Council does meet, it has a number of advisors on it, and as you know, advisor, and so is the comptroller, along with each of the three services and the Office of the General Counsel. The Nuclear Weapons Council is a very collaborative body. They operate on consensus, and it is working very efficiently at this point. And I would not recommend any changes to the membership, primarily because the way it is operating, the chairman and the members take into account fully comments from all of the advisors, including CAPE and including the comptroller.
Okay. Dr. Hopkins, what would the DOD's reaction to an annual requirement to give Congress a 25-year plan with expected budgets and funding for DOD nuclear forces? Would this be overly burdensome, and would it be useful or accurate looking at far ahead?
I think, if you want me to speculate on the DOD's reaction, I think, oh no, not another report. In general, the report would be perceived as burdensome, so that's the mechanics of it. In fact, as you know, we do look out. These programs we're talking about go well beyond the 5-year defense program time limit. We have to think well into the future years, and right now we submit a 10-year report that does have programs and costs on it. We do look out in order to actually see this modernization mountain that we've been talking about in the 2020s. As you'd expect, looking out that far, 25 years, the credibility of the numbers would be very, very suspect. However, the ability to look out that far and anticipate the need for future modernization, additional resources, or gauge the impact of decisions that we make today is very important to us. I would not recommend a new report, but I would instead recommend we do what we're doing now, which is sharing the baseline plan, which does go out 25 years, and share that information as we have been.
Okay. Let's talk about the B-61. In our hearing with General Klotz last month, we heard that NNSA's part of the B-61 Life Extension Program is proceeding well, on time, and on budget. Let's hear from the other side of the river. General Herensack, how's the Air Force portion of the B-61 LEP going? Are we going to get a full tail kit for this bomb that is on time and on budget? What are the primary risks for this program?
Yes, we're on time, we're on budget. We see absolutely nothing that would risk us not being able to deliver it by 2020 as required.
Great. Mr. Chair, what is DOD's position on a calls for the U.S. to ask our NATO allies to pay for part of the B-61 LEP?
Certainly our NATO allies have a lot of burden sharing in the DCA mission, but I would not recommend that sharing some of the cost of the B-61 would be part of that. They do a lot of burden sharing in terms of site security, in terms of sharing some of the costs for the storage, for NATO percentage costs, but to share costs on the B-61, I think would open up a lot of other issues, such as them having some understanding or wanting to be involved in some of the engineering and the design. All of that is quite sensitive, and I really don't think is something that we would want to open up to our NATO allies, especially because the B-61 is not just for the Europe DCA mission, but is for nuclear missions for us around the world.
Great. And I want to clarify, we have, the House has gone into recess for 15 minutes. At 4:30, they'll call us for votes. I yield to the ranking member for any additional questions he may have.
I have no more questions at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, then, Mr. Garamendi, do you have any more questions before we go into classified section? Okay. With that, we will recess while we travel down to 2337 in the skiff for the classified portion of this hearing.